growing up, I remember one of the central kind of focal shops in our neighborhood was the post office. I remember getting my first post office savings account. I remember going in there and the postmaster was like, he knew everybody's names and he was just like one of the great hubs and glues for the community. And it was like a profession and a place that was really sat at the bedrock of most communities. And I grew up in South London, so I can imagine what it's like in a village where there's like one single post office and, you know, the way that people interact. And I actually remember my mom telling me about somebody in the post office who would keep an eye on the older people that came into the post office to kind of get their pensions and stuff, and was the first port of call for one lady who had sadly passed, but he hadn't seen her, and she didn't have any immediate friend. Well, she had friends, scant friends at that age, but she didn't have any immediate family, and it was actually the postmaster that raised the alarm. It meant that she wasn't just undiscovered in her residence for, you know, weeks on end because somebody missed her, somebody that was expecting her. And so the next story that I'm going to get into is, for me, made all the more disheartening because of who the victims of this scandal were and what they really kind of represent in UK communities across the country and how they've been treated. It really speaks to the way that we allow institutions and corporations to divorce themselves from accountability, to victimize innocent people. And often this is painted as though the only people that happens to are quote unquote bad people. They're people in society that are undesirables or that haven't properly integrated. But seeing this happen to postmasters and mistresses should be a wake-up call for how unprotected we are as a people. Welcome to the Misinformation Podcast. I'm Z, aka the Reluctant Accountant, and today's episode is about one of the most shocking scandals in British legal history. So I just want you to imagine for a moment that you run a post office, okay? You're proud, you're like a trusted member of the community, and then one day the computer system tells you that you're short by like thousands and thousands of pounds. So you start panicking, you double check, you report it. But instead of getting help, you're arrested. Your reputation is ruined, you're taken to court, you lose everything. Your job, your savings, your dignity, maybe even your home, and in some cases, even your life. All because a computer made a mistake, people covered it up, and no one believed you. So if you haven't already worked it out, I'm going to talk about the Post Office Horizon scandal. And this isn't just a story about IT failure. It's about power, it's about accountability, and how the very systems that are meant to serve us can sometimes destroy us. So let's start at the beginning. So between 1999 and 2015, hundreds of post office postmasters and postmistresses, the people that kind of run the local branches, were accused of financial shortfalls. So the sums ranged from like a few £1,000s to tens of thousands of pounds, and the post office claimed that they were stealing. In total, 900 people were prosecuted, many were convicted, and dozens were imprisoned. This wasn't a handful of rogue employees. This was one of the most widespread miscarriages of justice in British legal history. And the real kicker is, they weren't stealing. The numbers were wrong because of a fault of the IT system called Horizon, which was built by the Japanese tech company Fujitsu. So what was happening was that the Horizon system was glitching. Sometimes it would duplicate transactions. Other times it would just simply lose data. But the post office refused to believe it. Instead, they told staff, "You're the only one this is happening to. You're the only one who's reported it," except they weren't. It was happening everywhere. And so even this idea of me, and I will probably say it within this episode, of the post office not believing them. It wasn't that the post office didn't believe them, because for them to turn around and tell people you're the only one that's reported it, knowing full well that other people had, the post office were lying. That's the nuts and bolts of it. They were lying to cover something up. And these aren't just white lies. These are people's livelihoods. So if we think about the impact that this had on the people, the postmasters themselves, the postmistresses, they went bankrupt. Some of them were suicidal. They were publicly shamed in court. And sometimes they were imprisoned with, actual criminals or other people based on phantom numbers from a flawed computer system. Some lost marriages, some lost children. At least 4 people died by suicide after being accused. So one man, Peter Murray, was accused of stealing £84,000. He was arrested at home in front of his kids, and he was cleared eventually, but he was emotionally shattered after this. Another lady, Seema Misra, was pregnant when she was jailed. And it's weird because we often talk about institutional failure in quite abstract terms, but this was a human disaster. And it happened in slow motion over many, many years. And crucially, it was covered up. Because as I mentioned before, the post office knew the problems with the Horizon system. They were very well aware, but they didn't want the reputational damage. So instead of fixing the system, instead of fixing the actual issue, they doubled down and they decided to blame staff or postmasters and postmistresses. So this is where this whole scandal becomes actually quite terrifying. So you may be thinking, well, how did this happen legally? How was this allowed to continue legally? So this is where it gets interesting and, as I said, terrifying. The post office is a private company, but it has a unique power. It can act as a prosecuting authority. So like the Crown Prosecution Service, for example. So when discrepancies arose in Horizon, the post office didn't call the police. They ran their own investigations, hired their own lawyers, and prosecuted hundreds of people without even considering that their own software might be to blame. I'm going to repeat that for you. They didn't call the police. They didn't need to. They just ran their own investigation and hired their own lawyers and then prosecuted people. Basically, they marked their own homework. There was no checks. There were no balances. Just ruin. It must be said that the post office is the only commercial organisation in Britain with the power to bring private prosecutions on this scale. So there was no external scrutiny. And even when cases went to court, sub-postmasters weren't allowed access to Horizon's code base or error logs. In some cases, the prosecution team actually withheld evidence that might have cleared them. This wasn't just an IT scandal. It was a legal and institutional breakdown on multiple levels. And so now we get into one of the most infuriating parts of this, because this, obviously, it didn't just happen by accident. If we think about who knew and when, there were whistleblowers, there were internal reports, and senior leaders in the post office and even in government ignored them. So in 2009, they had this external investigation by Second Sight, and that raised concerns about Horizon's reliability. So what was the post office's response? They just cancelled the contract. They buried the report and they denied there was a problem. So in 2013, the BBC and Computer Weekly began reporting on inconsistencies. Victims began to connect online, they formed support groups, shared stories, and they realised they actually weren't alone. And then, eventually, a man named Alan Bates, yes, the same one played by Toby Jones in the ITV series, led a group litigation order against the post office. And in 2019, the High Court ruled in their favour. The judge actually said the post office's approach amounted to institutional obstinacy, and they treated the Horizon system as infallible despite ample evidence to the contrary. Infallible, that word again. So you might be wondering, where Fujitsu is in all of this? The answer is everywhere and nowhere. They built Horizon, they maintained it, and they updated it. And when things went wrong, they often knew. Internal Fujitsu emails disclosed during the court case showed engineers discussing known bugs. In some cases, they even remotely access branches' accounts to make adjustments without the knowledge of the postmasters. But no one told the courts, and Fujitsu still got paid, still got contracts, still quietly picked up public sector work, even after the scandal broke. I mean, can we take a moment? So imagine you have this builder that demolishes the wrong house. Are you then going to give them a contract to build Parliament? Because that's what this feels like. So where are we now? The public part of the inquiry has just concluded and the inquiry itself is still underway. There are talks of compensation, though it's slow and it's patchy. And as of this episode, only a fraction of the wrongful convictions have been overturned. And the victims, they're still waiting. Some have died, some are too traumatized to go back to work, and some have never recovered. And the post office, well, the CEO eventually resigned. No criminal charges have ever been brought. Fujitsu's executives have offered apologies, but no one's gone to jail. And as for the government ministers who signed off on this year after year, crickets. And so when you think of this post office scandal, because we call it the Post Office Horizon scandal, and that can sometimes frame it as though it's just this IT issue. And it isn't. It's really about power without accountability and the danger of that. It's what happens when a computer system becomes more trusted than people and when institutions care more about their reputation than the truth. And when no one in charge is brave enough to say, something's not right here. And so we need to really think about this, especially, I think, in the context of the world in which we're currently living in. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, postmasters, postmistresses have always held a really unique and special place within UK communities. They can sometimes be the hub of that community where people meet up from, if you're in a village or just a smaller community, where they get to know everybody in the community because of the interactions that we have with them. And sure, it can be said with the rise of like the internet and emails, we definitely use post offices less and less, but they still held for such a long time a very important role within our society. And if you were going to speak about any upstanding member of the community, a postmaster or mistress would have been a good place to start. And so to see this scandal unravel in that way, to see their needs and their lives disregarded in such a callous manner, it really makes you think about our role in society and how this notion of constantly putting profits over people will eventually come knocking at your door. Because a lot of the time, I've heard phrases like, well, you shouldn't be worried if you're not doing anything wrong. And when actual checks and balances are in place to keep institutions and the like in check, there's this idea that it's overreach and it's anti-competitive and we're just slowing things down. But ultimately, we actually can't just rely on good people to do good things all the time, because the system in which we live in is inherently incentivizes people not to do the right thing. It incentivizes you to disregard your humanity and take the easy way out and actually not really care about the fallout and the victims of that, as long as you retain power, as long as money continues to flow inwards, and as long as you can't be reprimanded for it. And so when we have these huge institutional failures, such as this, such as we saw with Grenfell, and no one is held to account, I feel like it really chips away a little bit at everybody, at our collective humanity, because we are absorbing that and we have to sit in a world where these things happen. And unless you have these brave, tireless, courageous people like the Alan Bateses of the world who are willing to stop at nothing to get justice, essentially, the deck of cards are always going to be stacked against us. And I think that's really sad. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to try and be a little bit like Alan Bates, or at least not to stay silent and to challenge things that are unjust and to speak truth to power. So that's all I've got time for in today's episode. Thank you for joining me again. I will, of course, be back next week with another episode. If you want to catch me in the meantime, in between time, I am on TikTok and I am on Instagram at The Reluctant Accountant. That's at The Reluctant Accountant. But until then, have a good one.